Dive in to the latest edition of the Richard and Judy Book Club podcast, exclusive to WHSmith. Sarah Winman is back with her beautiful book, A Year of Marvellous Ways.
He put down his buckets next to a battered lamp and climbed the caravan steps. A braid of damp seaweed hung from a telescope that was roped tightly to the outside slats. He pushed the door gently and encountered the strangest world he had ever seen. The room was still and warm, just the muffled sound of fire crackling in the stove, the occasional creak from the wooden wheels long embedded in decades of mud and mulch. The air was clear and smelt of pine and something else he couldn't put a word to, something feminine, something intoxicating. He went over to the bed and sat down. The wall opposite had been covered in shells. A mosaic of periwinkles and limpets mainly, hundreds of shells meticulously arranged in patterns of sea swells and waves. And at the back, on the ledge below the window, in the dust and dark, a small bookcase housing a single book. A compact, lockable ledger, hand-scrawled down the spine, the Marvellous Book of Truths. Drake pulled out the book and ran his forefinger down the words. He looked for a key, but couldn't find one. He put pressure on the lock, but the lock wouldn't budge. He put it back into the dusty chink for another day.
Well, welcome to the Richard and Judy Book Club podcast. And the book we're talking about today is magical realism, I think is the carapace under which it exists. It's called A Year of Marvellous Ways. The writer is an old friend of ours on the book club, Sarah Winman, because we had her first novel, When God Was a Rabbit, in one of our lists a few years ago. This is her second. As I say, it's called A Year of Marvellous Ways. It's 1947, and Marvellous Ways is a woman. That's her name, and she's in her 90th year. And she's waiting for what? She doesn't know, but living quietly in the remote Cornish creek that's become her home for almost all of her life, Marvellous is certain that she will recognise her fate, her destiny, when it finally materialises. And when a broken soldier washes up in the tiny estuary on which she lives, the last great circle of Marvellous's life begins to turn. It's utterly engrossing from start to finish, and Sarah's here now. Congratulations on it.
Thank you very much.
Great piece of work, great piece of writing. You do pick unusual names and titles. It's almost your hallmark. I mean, you know, When God Was a Rabbit is one of the most unusually titled novels I can remember. It almost put me off, it was so unusual. Marvellous Ways, where did her name come from?
The name Marvellous came with the character, which was the problem. Because as soon as I knew that it was 1947, then how do you allow a character with the name Marvellous in broken Britain, when everybody say Marjorie or Roger? How do we make that believable? Because, you know, when you are dealing with, yes, partly magic realism or a great leap of the suspension of disbelief, it still needs to be anchored somewhere, and it needs to be anchored in believability. So this was the major problem. How is Marvellous? How are people going to accept it? And it is a little story I tell, because what it was about was finding permission for this name. And it came about quite extraordinary, that I was in hospital with my mum, nothing serious, and she was waiting for some results, and a nurse came out, and she said, Winman. And we put up her hand. We said, yes, over here. She goes, no, Winman. She had a very strong accent. She was from Nigeria. And I go, yes.
It's us.
It's us, Winman. She goes, why aren't you Winwoman? But it's brilliant. And then she said, you have to understand, I come from a country where names matter. And I was like, thank you. And it's in there. And Marvellous says, you know, my father gave me my name. He brought my name back across the seas. My father gave me my name. He travelled to places where names mattered, and he brought my name back across the sea, and he put it in this small shell box together with my calling. And then I realised, yes, she can have that name, and we have to link it with a country where names matter. And as soon as I had that, and as soon as her name was in place, then I figured we're okay with peace and we're okay with Francis Drake.
It's like with African Americans, women are called things like precious.
Completely.
Which is strange to our culture, but not at all in theirs.
Not at all. I mean, you know, I've said that I love Toni Morrison's work. Well, Toni Morrison, a lot of characters may have 3 names. They'll have a birth name, they'll have a community name, they'll have a slave name. And really what this whole process of naming on a deep level is about identity. And this is what it was about. So Marvellous is about her identity. She's been given this name because the start in her life was not quite marvellous.
But, as we say, it starts in her 90th year in terms of the story, and she has become marvellous, and she is about to be marvellous in the usual sense of the word. And I'll tell you, we talk about magical realism, I'll tell you where you had me, and that was it, and I was completely locked into the book, was when you almost insistently toss off the detail that Marvellous's mother was a mermaid and was shot by mistake as a seal. Somebody thought she was a seal and got shot, but actually she was a mermaid frolicking in the water, which, taken cold in this conversation, sounds crazy, and you think, oh, I can't read something like that. But your disbelief is fully suspended by that stage, and it was just a lovely touch in the story.
Well, I'm pleased.
It really worked.
But that's another sense of anchoring it. And I knew that I always wanted it for her mother to be a mermaid. And it's explained how she becomes one. I mean, also, if people are really going, oh, no, when she actually says that, she's saying it to Drake, and one of the things that Drake responds is like, yes, the young soldier. He goes, oh, here we go. But you know, that he is mirroring what we as readers need to mirror. You are supposed to look at that and go, apart from you, who got it straight away, but you know, go, oh, where are we going with this? Because that is the journey of him. That is his preconceptions, that is his prejudice of age, that is all of those things that come up until he starts to see those fissures in her life and understand what is the truth through these stories. And that's when he cares. And so we have another mermaid at the start of the book told by Missy. But, and I say to people, so Missy is talking about this mermaid that her grandmother knew in the Thames. And I said, why is that so hard to believe? Because in my lifetime, there have been dolphins in the Thames, and if I remember rightly, there was a small whale not long ago. Do you remember that?
There was, yes.
So, a fin is a fin, as far as I'm concerned. And when this was told that there was this whale, when you got closer to the river, it was gridlocked. People were down there. And you know why? People wanted to see the whale. And in this case, people wanted to see the mermaid. It's irrelevant whether it's real, but people want to see something that the norm of society don't see because it makes them special. And when there's something special, it means that, you know what, maybe my things, maybe these dreams, maybe these parts of my life that I want to be true will come true.
The story is set in Cornwall, which I mean is wonderful for me because I set my books in Cornwall as well. I remember asking you in When God Was a Rabbit whether that wonderful house on the banks of the Loo estuary was real because you wrote it, and you said no because you wrote it. It sounded so incredibly real. And this is set in this is inspired by St Justin Roseland.
Yes, it is.
Which I know very well, and which is a very, very beautiful creek, isn't it?
It's paradise, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
I mean,
beautiful Cornish creek.
Yeah, I catch myself sometimes saying, you know, you go to these places in Cornwall and my goodness, you could be anywhere. And it's a very strange thing to say. It's like, well, why would you want to be anywhere else when you're here? But it does convey that sort of the temperate climate, the lushness of it.
And the otherness of it.
The otherness of it, that you could pick it up and place it somewhere else.
And the separateness, it's so completely separate from anywhere else. I think it feels even more different from going to, say, Ireland, which is a proper island. Cornwall isn't. It's attached to the mainland, although it's virtually split by the Tamar. But the atmosphere in Cornwall is very odd.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is like, you know, I think we said it when we met before, that if you look at certainly, say, the men in Cornwall, say the 17th and 18th century, they were the most well-travelled men of the country.
That's right, yes.
They went every continent. However, they never went over the Tamar. and it's no, they never did. They went out from the coast, you know, west and then down to South Africa.
Well, you capture that separateness and that difference beautifully in the book. You really do. And we should say that really it's a book about healing, and it's a book about how this elderly woman is able to restore a broken man.
Called Francis Drake.
Well, what else? Called Francis Drake, who's essentially washed up, almost literally, into her life. and she then spends the ensuing weeks and months healing his desperate psychological war wounds. And that's a beautifully written process. I wondered if that was purely from, you know, your cerebral cortex, or if you'd researched that kind of therapy, post-traumatic stress therapy, or is it all out of your imagination?
No, it is from my imagination. But, you know, I've lived a few years now, and I'm very interested in the psychology of people, right from, you know, the first psychologist I ever met, probably in my early 20s. And I think that's when you are very open in your 20s to discover that, because you're on the cusp of everybody saying you're an adult, and of course you're not. And it's a very tender time. So I've always been very interested in the psychology of trauma and the journey that people go on, and narrative therapy, the retelling of stories in order to make our lives a little bit more triumphant. That story came from, well, the idea of it was an old soldier I knew who had fought in the war, and
the last war, the Second War.
Yeah, Second World War. And he was in his 80s when he was telling me the story about his life. It's not this one, but it could have been very similar. And I realised that he needed to tell someone in detail before he died. And I was the telling. And all he wanted was me to say, you know what, it's all right. And you were all right. And that he needed just somebody to hear it, and for him to let go of the images that he saw. And I think that's all anybody in life wants. We all want someone to bear witness to our experience of life. Quite simply to tell us that we are okay.
Well, to just say to everyone listening to this, you will not find it hard to suspend your disbelief in this book, and in doing so you will immerse yourself in an absolutely wonderful literary experience, but it's very accessible, it's incredibly readable, and it's beautiful, and it has a lovely ending. It's A Year of Marvellous Ways by Sarah Winman, and just to say that if you get the book from WHSmith as opposed to anywhere else, from there you will get copies which have extra content in the back. You have the Q&A that Judy and I give to the author. The author writes their own article about what motivated them, the process of writing the book, what it did for them. And there's lots of other content as well, but only if you get the book from WHSmith. So, you know, it's just letting you know, really. Sarah, lovely to see you again.
You too.
And many
Thank you
congratulations
so much.
on a fabulous piece of work.
Thank you.
Great.
It's lovely.
WH Smith and Richard and Judy. There is no better book club and no better team.
The character of Marvellous Ways came pretty formed in the sense that I wanted to write about an older woman, and she came with her name. All characters, I suppose, they're an amalgam of who we are, you know, who I am as a person, what my history is, the people who have come into my life. So, you know, that is what it is. It's not somebody that I saw and wanted to reinterpret, because I don't think I could have. However, physically, I do have some friends, older people in my life who are small and, you know, have the same physical characteristics. And you take those characteristics because those are the things that make situations real. But I just think it was really a mix of conversations and people from my past and me, and the possibility of my ageing. I knew it was going to be a lyrical book. That was part of the style of it, and some parts of the book would have its own poetry, because that also was very important, especially when we're in Marvellous's world and the way Marvellous talks about people from her past. I do everything that writing schools tell you not to do, basically. I never got to the end. Really, seriously, I had so many drafts that didn't get to the end, because the end actually I already had. I wasn't worried about the end. What really I needed to do was to get the voice, to get, you know, a mix of my voice and the voice of the piece right. And so that required reworking it a lot before I moved on, which is really not the way I would. I hope I don't write another book like that, and I wouldn't recommend it. But they're all different. And I think you come at each one organically, and everyone is different. So it did take a lot of rewriting, and then once you've got some sentences right, and once you've got a paragraph and suddenly you've got a page right, you do feel you move on. I treat it as a job, I suppose. I sit down and I try to get the hours in, so it would be at least 10 till 6. I've stopped doing the I can do 1,000 words a day, because some days I can't, and I don't feel that's not a sign of failure. You know, 200 good ones are better than 1,000 just there while you're looking at your word count. So basically what I've done is I have taken off the word count on my computer. I don't think it's particularly useful. You know, I'm learning all the time. I'm not there yet, and I doubt I'll be there to the end of my days. You know, it's a continual process of finding out. It's the same way of finding out who you are as a writer is finding out who you are as a person. And I just think it will change every time. So given that, no, my routine's changed a lot, I think.
Well, it's not that often that we have an author back for a second time in the Richard and Judy Book Club, but we have here, it's Sarah Winman again. And why? Well, I guess really because it's a unique piece of writing. I say unique, it falls under that kind of carapace of magical realism. So there are books a bit like it out there, but not one that's quite like this. I mean, if you have a story about an elderly woman who just quite casually remarks that her mother was a mermaid, and the mermaid was once shot dead while frolicking in the sea, mistaken for a seal, and you're able to accept that, you're actually able to suspend your disbelief to the extent that that seems fine, then you know you've got something special. And I think that's the case with this book. If you analyse it, it's all impossible. It's all kind of half crazy. But in its own world, in its own reality, it works beautifully. And the writing and the description of this Cornish creek, where most of the action, as it were, takes place, is just delightful. And it's a world that you want to stay in. This world of half reality. It's almost like being in someone else's dream, isn't it?
Mm. And Sarah is also the way she talks to us when she's describing her book, and the processes she went through to write it, is herself almost dreamlike. She's absolutely mesmeric, isn't she? You can't stop listening to her.
Her answers are almost like poems.
Yeah.
She almost talks in poetry. It's extraordinary.
She sets the book in Cornwall, St Justin Roseland in Cornwall, and you can almost imagine herself a Cornish wise woman.
Yes.
You can imagine her sort of sitting there telling you about life and the universe and all the rest of it.
Yep.
She's a philosopher,
yes,
but she's also very funny and very quick with words, very fey. I love the book.
And if you missed Sarah's previous visits to the book club, you could always go back and listen again via iTunes. Just search for Richard and Judy.
From the Richard and Judy Book Club, I selected Catherine Chanter's The Well. I thought it was going to be amazing, and so far I haven't been disappointed. A couple escape to a country farm, and it all changes from there on.
I've just read A Man Called Ove, written by Frederick Backman. Not a book I would have chosen, it was given to me. It took a couple of chapters to get into. Once into it, I couldn't stop loving it. I love the way the past explains the now, and the now gives you hope for the future.
I've read Elizabeth is Missing. I really enjoyed the book. I enjoyed the relationships between the mother and the daughter, and then the granddaughter to her grandmother. The granddaughter had a different take on her Alzheimer's, as she could see the humour inside it and actually saw her grandmother, I think, still as a person, where the mother found it all very stressful. I also found it really quite heartbreaking, as it's obviously an awful illness, but it put a human element into it.
Well, we have a trusting child narrator for our next adventure here on the Richard and Judy Book Club podcast, exclusive to WHSmith.
I'm Claire Fuller, the author of Our Endless Numbered Days. I really wanted to write a book, and I think I probably am quite a tenacious person. When I start something, I want to finish, just to see it through to the end.